Namaste. Welcome to Urban Chatterati. And today I'm joined by Pandit Satish Kumar Sharma, who is one of the founder directors of the Global Hindu Federation. Namaskar and welcome, Satish ji.
Ramji, it's a pleasure to be with you. I've enjoyed watching your programs and your channel develop. And so it genuinely is an honor to be able to speak to your audience.
My pleasure, sir. So, sir, today we are going to discuss the issues surrounding the Rashmi Samant and the Oxford University. As we read here, apparently a police case has been filed against one of the faculty member in the Oxford who has basically harassed and targeted Rashmi Samant based on Hindu phobia, targeting her family, targeting her community. And also, we have seen today that Oxford India Society, along with Oxford Hindu Society and Oxford South Asian Society, has come out with a statement which justifies the attack on Rashmi Samant and basically dismisses any charge of racism or Hindu phobia against her. So, could you please tell us what is happening at Oxford at the moment?
Yes, it's quite easy to slice it and dice it and then dissect it and understand the sequence and indeed the players. So there is the situation which arose up to her election. And up to her election, everything was wonderful. There was the usual university politics, and that's fine. But once she had been elected, a group of people undertook it upon themselves. They were unhappy with her election. They started to trawl through past social media posts, and a campaign started to vilify her. Now, this is not an acceptable way in which to engage with any issue, but that campaign unearthed a number of posts, three in particular, and interpreted them in a manner which was deemed to be offensive. Those images were then circulated and the rhetoric was constructed that they were inoffensive. Now, I've already addressed the issue of the degree to which they were offensive or not, in that I've spoken with members, for example, of the Jewish community and presented them with the image which was deemed to be insensitive and offensive to Jews. Anti-Semitic was the actual term they used. And my Jewish connections have confirmed. In fact, several of them looked at the images and said, I'm sorry, what's the problem with it? We understand that it's not a nice thing to be traipsing around a memorial, but that's not anti-Semitic. And, one has to operate leeway when we're dealing with international communities and understanding and nuance and all that. So it was not anti-Semitic. But that seems to have been avoided by the people who raised this storm. So this environment was created whereby she was being attacked. A campaign was targeted towards pressurizing the students' union, and the students' union then, rather than stepping back and looking at the actual allegations, taking independent advice, decided to exert pressure upon her, and that pressure was exerted. She tried to recover the situation by indicating to people that there was no malice intended, there was no intention to create offense, and there is sufficient flexibility and freedom of variance in the way in which we all communicate to have accommodated that actually those images at worst were innocently insensitive. And that's not a crime for a 17-year-old, 18-year-old to be guilty of. Children grow through these stages. That's one point where I'd like to draw the line. The wave then occurred, and that was after this Abhijit Sarkar posted his remarks. Now, his remarks were posted, and they added to the fuel of unpleasant rhetoric, and cyberbullying started to then appear. Wise people could have intervened at that point and said, this is unacceptable. The Hindu society, the various societies you have spoken about, they could have intervened at that point and said, this is offensive to us. They did not. And that is something to be noted. Their statements came out so far after the event, and they have done the classic two-step, in that we condemn all parties, but really they themselves are worthy of condemnation for the lack of character and the lack of interaction and engagement at an early stage, which would have prevented harm coming to Rashmi. The ideal situation, when you think that there are so many people who supposedly are intelligent, wise, educated, the pinnacle of education, the elite of discrimination, understanding, and research, you would have thought they would have been able to deal with this issue and contain it. rather than it becoming a lynch mob attack on one individual. And that dimension is a dimension which I think really needs to be addressed. What it has done is it's revealed, it's unveiled the presence in Oxford of a group of people who are actually quite unpleasant. They are emotionally immature. Hitchens uses a phrase which is one of my favorites. He described people of this ilk as being emotional hemophiliacs, that they bruise, their emotions bruise very, very quickly at the slightest hint of something that might be able to be interpreted as an offense. But the other aspect, which I think is very, very unpleasant, is the degree to which people are willing to leverage the capacity to take offense in order to attack somebody and to bully somebody. That's entirely unacceptable. One of the most unpleasant aspects of this is that transphobia, racism, anti-Semitism, these are very serious issues. They influence and impact harmfully on many people's lives. But to leverage such serious issues, to attach them to innocent, relatively harmless, and completely unintentional, without malice posts, that indicates the presence of some very, very unpleasant people there. And this issue needs to be addressed. If Dr. Sarkar is typical of the presence of such unpleasant people, then the university is, in my mind, neglecting its role and its responsibility and to safeguard the university experience.
Yes. And even if you read that statement, the statement is all about blaming Rashmi Samant for what happened to her. It completely ignores that they were outrightly racist, Hindu phobic attacks against her. It completely ignores her hounding. It completely ignores that she was mentally harassed and tortured by the same bunch of people who claim to speak for sensitivity and tolerance. And now, in the end, the statement says that, well, we are issuing a statement against what is happening because it is feeding into Hindutva politics back home and it is strengthening the fascists in India. So we need to take a stand. And they can't take a stand against the fascist and the people who harass a Indian girl in the campus, but they want to take stand about what is happening in the Indian politics. So what explains the politics of these South Asian groups and this so-called Oxford Hindu student groups and all?
It's the hypocrisy is actually quite nauseating, isn't it? You can quite happily sit around while somebody like Surkar is making those posts, and some of those posts predate this incident. It's not as though they're suddenly items that he's posted, and yet none of the champions of the Hindu tradition in Oxford seem to have noticed that they were present. But once the political machinery swung into place, once they decided to leverage some innocent posts for political advantage, all of a sudden everybody becomes very, very sensitive to the capacity of being offended. It's nothing other than that nonsensical, immature politics that really should be confined to student meeting halls and student debates. But when you bring it out into the real world and you cause a person harm, so much harm that they flee the country, and then you continue to vilify, defame, and libel them, you're into the space of grown-ups. And these statements that have been made by Humsoc and the Indian societies, they are being scrutinized right now by lawyers. And we will determine at some point in time as to the degree to which they have libeled and slandered Rashmi Samant. And then some of these students who are here in university to study, to become mature adults, to be released on an innocent, unsuspecting world where they're going to hopefully contribute for the betterment of humanity, they will perhaps learn a lesson that one really needs to be a little bit more circumspect in the degree to which one publishes defamatory statements.
That's a very very important point. So basically, you are planning or you are contemplating legal action against these South Asian groups in the campuses.
Well, there's obviously something deficient in their education, and I think it's beholden upon us who are a little bit older, wiser, and more mature to complete that deficiency in their education.
But tell us something about the politics of these South Asian groups in the university campuses, and also this sudden, mushrooming of Hindu groups who are progressive Hindus, and they invite all kind of anti-Hindu speakers and the all kind of anti-Hindu academicians, like in America, like Audrey Trushke, and they claim to be progressive Hindus. So, what is this new kind of politics which is emerging in the Western university campuses?
I think we're seeing a separation and a clarification of identity labels. they appropriate the title Hindu. But if you're a Hindu, then you'll be familiar with the Natya Shastra, for example, which absolutely places as divine the freedom to offense. It makes clear statements about the space of a stage, or the space where academics, intellectuals, artists, painters function to communicate uncomfortable truths to us as being sacred spaces. And if you don't adhere and revere that principle, then really I would question your right to be able to assert yourself as being a follower of Sanatan Dharma and the Hindu tradition. One thing is absolutely certain. What we are seeing is the emergence of a group of very articulate, um, uh, shall we say, very competent in terms of the English medium space, but hopelessly ignorant of the actual ancestry that they are claiming allegiance to. Very few of them have any sense of what history they are the inheritors of, the heritage, the culture, the spiritual explorations that go with being a Hindu seem to be completely absent. I'm reminded of a phrase I used once. We would call many of these children Macaulay's kids, in that they seem to be the product of a program of conditioning, and they have no genuine sense of what has actually been done to them. They're emotive, they're passionate, but to some degree, there is an element of hollowness there. And the speed with which we see a transgression occurring in the United Kingdom suddenly being transformed into the usual allegations, the ad hominems. Oh, it must be Hindutva. Oh, it must be to do with right-wing BJP politics. And it's only a question of time before one of them suddenly puts the whole blame at Prime Minister Modi's door. And if you have a look at Sarkar's post, what on earth has this got to do with Karnataka? And yet he quite happily, as an intelligent academic, sort of lauded by many of the universities that he's been with, and blessed with funding, significant funding, he quite happily seems to be able to assert that the whole of Karnataka is Islamophobic, and by association, because she is from that area, she is therefore Islamophobic. Where are the Hindu societies? Where is the Students' Union who are saying
I
this
mean,
is outrageous?
that's as racist and as Hinduphobic as it gets, making this kind of allegation.
It's extraordinary. And this in Oxford, of all places. We are used to dealing with academics and being blessed by the teachings of academics who are familiar with the nuance associated with each and every word, the coloring of communication and how communication works on multiple layers. And then you have this sledgehammer of an unpolished remark tossed in that because she is from Karnataka, she is clearly Islamophobic. Um, One would, it's beyond belief that this is the quality of communication that seems to be flowing, and flowing without censure by the authorities who are responsible for ensuring that it does not flow.
So basically, what has been the role and response of the Oxford University out here? Are they neglecting it? Are they tolerating it? Or they are just indifferent in the sense they don't care about what happens to Indians and the Hindus in their campus? And basically, many people are now saying that the Western universities are becoming unsafe place for the Hindus and the Indians because of this hounding done by vested interests.
I think there are two dimensions to what you have said. One is that we are now having a body of Hindu students who are competent and who are articulate in the English language to be able to articulate what's being done to them, and to be able to express it in language and sentiment that is comprehensible to the departments who have been traditionally supremacist, whether they have been colonialist and supremacist in that dimension, or whether they've been white and supremacist, or whether they have just been infected with this notion that anything Hindu is automatically inferior. So there is now an increasing body of second, third generation students who are being able to say, no, we do not accept this. This is what you're doing to us. I think we also have to recognize that there is a centrism in white Christianist academia, and that centrism assumes that its own worldview is sacrosanct, and it applies that lens to anything and everything. And so often remarks are made, and you can understand that they're made innocently and ignorantly, but they have to be taught, and they have to be taught in the language that they understand of what is actually going on. So we've seen in Rutgers where a line has been drawn, and that line actually identifies a colonial fault line. There was a time when a white person, for no other purposes than self-aggrandizement, would go off to a colony somewhere and come back and speak eloquently in dining halls and in tables and centers of learning about the experiences that they had themselves understood and acquired mastery of. And in that manner, they would acquire a degree of prominence. They would acquire a degree of attainment and courtesy and respect. But that's complete nonsense. And I could not come to your house and then go to a third person's place and lecture on the things that I had found in your house. It would be so rude. It would be offensive. It's not the act of a civilized person. But we still have people who, I must say, are lacking in the degree of civilization, certainly lacking in their degree of civility, in that they feel it's perfectly acceptable to scrutinize and dissect a living community, a society and a civilization which is vibrant, which is ebullient, and it's full of life, and yet they seem to think they can dissect it and project their opinion, and their opinion should carry more weight than the opinions of the civilization that's being spoken of. What a nonsense that is. It really does bring into scrutiny the validity of this whole notion of Indology. The very aspect of Indology itself has a supremacist and a power dynamic built into it. It also seems to assume legitimacy in being able to look at other human beings from a point of view of superior scrutiny. That's so abhorrent and offensive. And if we were to create a field of study called Anglology, shall we say, and let's study this particularly violent tribe of Angles who emerged out of France, Germany a few thousand years ago, and then traipsed over to England where they wreaked havoc, and then they went on to their ships all around the world and wreaked havoc. We wouldn't do that sort of thing to living people of that tradition because it's rude. We would do it with cultural sensitivity and with the intention that hopefully we can all learn from it and move closer. But people in many of these universities do exactly the same thing, but without the intention of us moving closer, without the intention of us learning, but with the intention of causing harm, offense, and suffering, and literally pouring salt on civilizational wounds. That's not what academia is for. And I think our student body, and indeed our academics, are now beginning to say, no, this we will not permit. And so we will see more and more instances as the rebuttals come thick and fast in the English language, in places like Oxford, in places like Rutgers, etc., etc. This is going to be a robust engagement. And I would say to our students, I would encourage them to develop the strength of character and the solidity of being part of a civilization which is so ancient and um, so subtle in terms of what it's understood, and to engage with these issues. I would encourage them to go to universities in the West and present the case for Sanatan Dharma and for Bharat. It's necessary, the world needs it, and we actually really do need to do it for our own benefit and our own tranquility.
You just talked about Indology in the Western universities, but now what we see is that there is no Indology, there is South Asian studies. And what we see sitting at India, that most of the South Asian scholars or most of these South Asian groups, I mean, they are almost every time hostile towards India, or they are blatantly anti-Hindu. So, what is this South Asia all about? Because we know India is an actual country, but South Asia is a fantasy. We don't know any such entity in our lived experience in our daily life. I don't think any other country knows about it. I don't think even Pakistanis know what South Asia is. They are Pakistanis, we are Indians. So why this South Asia group? Why they are mushrooming? Why they are so actively involved in all kind of anti-India protest and also targeting Hindus and Hindu festivals, by the way?
It's a wonderful question. And I think we must recognize that the evidence in front of us indicates that colonialism has not finished. The colonialism adventure or misadventure, we assume that in 1947 it finished, but actually it didn't finish. Those people who had built established power bases, infrastructure, universities, legislative systems, all of those structures were built on colonialist perspectives. They didn't disappear overnight. And what has happened is that an attempt has been made to cover up the colonialist past. It's not an accident that in British schools nothing is taught about colonialism. It's not an accident that throughout Europe none of the schools are taught about the Christian evangelical motivation behind much of what happened in colonialism. I was reading a subject the other day. It was a speech made by Queen Victoria, and in it she was writing how impressed she was that the development of the railway in India would actually support the Christianization of the people of the island. So it was a very real, apparent, and clear motive. It didn't disappear overnight. What has happened is it's gone underground. The motivation is there, and the motivation is dual if you think about it. Once the colonies realize what was done to them and the severity of what was done to them and start to talk about it, then it will undermine the legitimacy that the West assumes in projecting its own value system as being superior. That legitimacy is immensely valuable to them. Once the colonies start to talk about what was really done to them and start to share the information about what was done between them, once the African colonial experience combines with the Indian colonial experience, what we will see is the desire to express an indigenous authentic identity. And that identity is what poses such a threat to the ongoing vision of colonization, which is still very real. One way in which a scurrilous knave would seek to define, would seek to diminish another person would be to define their own frames of reference. By calling us South Asians, in the dialogue, the word India disappears. The word Bharat disappears. Referring to somebody from that nation as a Bharatiya suddenly creates the presence of an individual who is a member of an ancient civilization which has been on the receiving end of violence for a long period of time. And the last thing they want to do is to have people using words like Bharatiya, etc. And so what they do, and it's a common mischievous act of framing. They are always defining the terms by which we should think and talk about ourselves. And a part of what our responsibility is to define our own terms. It's no longer the white savior's task to define reality for us, nor to define how the experience of being who we are is defined. We should do that ourselves. So every time you see a South Asian reference, you have to acknowledge that either it's a person who has been intellectually or academically colonized to a degree that they are completely a tool in this process, or it's a person who is proliferating an agenda of colonization. I would go as far as to suggest that by persisting with colonial tropes, it's actually an abuse of our human rights. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People makes it absolutely crystal clear. And yet the academic institutions, they ride a coach and horses through that declaration. It's up to us to demand that declaration be respected and for us to define how we are defined.
So my last question to you, Satish ji, is
Ji.
what is being done in the Western university to sensitize people about Hindu phobia? Because this, as the situation stands today, the Hindu phobia is not even recognized. And mostly it's the people who are from the Indian origin or who are Indians, they deny that there is something called Hindu phobia. But if you look at their media, if you look at their academia, you will hardly find any positive portrayal or even neutral portrayal of the Hindus and the India out there. So what is being done to sensitize, to counter this kind of Hindu phobic tendencies, which might be, not malicious in the sense that not intended, but that is, as you're saying, inbuilt in their psyche now.
Yes. Well, it's a task that is in front of us, and we have to do this. Not only do we have to do this for our own benefit, but we have to do it for the benefit of all of the indigenous civilizations, because this same phobia is a wholly inappropriate word. The imperial colonial structures, they're not frightened of the colonies at all. There is not a single colonialist of Hindus. And to be perfectly honest, generally speaking, we're not very fearful people. Our history does have very courageous people, but we are not a people who take pride in being feared like many other communities do. And so the notion of a Hindu phobic is in itself an oxymoron. And I think part of the process is that we need to define the terms in which we identify these terms. We need to give them meaning. We need to give them definition. We need then to move towards giving them legal acceptance and political acceptance. And this process has started. Here in the United Kingdom in 2016, I recognize that the word Hindu phobia it contains an internal contradiction. And so it will never be a word which is comfortable in legislation, and we needed another word. So at that time, I sculpted the use of a word called Hindu odium, which is actually a person who has a sense of odium towards Hindus. And odium from the Latin is to find repulsive, to find contemptuous, to be uh, to remove from one's presence, to get rid of something that is, example, odor. The word of an unpleasant scent is from that word. And so we need to take the initiative and start to define our own vocabulary for our own protection. This is a project that has to be done. I'm actually very confident because what's going to happen is that as we become familiar with the legislative systems which function in the West, and you have to remember these legislative systems, they are polished, they are policies which are beautiful, shiny, and everything else, but we never use them. And nobody ever wants to teach us that actually this is the way to do this. That's changing. In the UK, it's changing dramatically now. We are beginning to become engaged with the political systems and indeed the legislative systems. And so we will identify exactly what hatred for Hindus is, how it manifests, and how it needs to be addressed as part of our fundamental human rights. We have a lot of work ahead of us. Your viewers may not know, but of the 26 states in the European Union, 24 of them do not have state-level recognition of Sanatan Dharma as a religion. And yet this is the European Union, which has been wanting to question Bharat on its human rights and everything else. Isn't it such a huge oversight? As we learn of these things, we're going to engage and communicate, and we will then get a balanced appreciation. The other thing is that we really do need to have support from Indian government agencies for Bharat to tell its own true story in a much more robust manner. We do not need to have India, Bharat approaching the West in any way which is subservient, submissive. It needs to be assertive. It has the right and the authority. And if the two influences work together, within a very short space of time, we will see not only India as an economic powerhouse, but its true position, which is as a civilizational store of some of the most incredible human lessons about how to live on this planet, that will then also attain the appropriate level of respect, courtesy, and appreciation. It has to be done. We have to do it.
Yeah. So thank you, Pandit Satish Sharma ji, for talking to us and telling the audience about what is the situation at the Oxford and what are the works being done by you and your foundation. And we hope that the things will improve and Rashmi Samant will get justice despite all the attempts to blame the victim or to deny racism and, let's say, the hounding of the Hindu students in the university campuses of the Western world today. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thank you, Abhinavji. It's been a pleasure to engage with you. I look forward to our next outing, and we will keep you updated on developments as they occur.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. And thank you, audience, for listening to us. See you soon.